Shell, and we are going to stream a two-part lesson or a two-part show where we discuss bringing things to life with your NPCs. So this is going to be a two-part series, part A, part B, running the game. Generally, when we teach in Fantasy Grounds, we usually go over the mechanics and what Fantasy Grounds can do, but we often leave out the things that most people struggle with, and that's the role playing aspects, and also the fact that these creatures have a life, they have an ecology, they have to fit into the world. So we're gonna cover both aspects. So the first part is going to be as long as we need it, but hopefully not more than an hour and a half or so. But we're going to cover a few different NPCs and some variations on the commoners. So I will bring up my list. So today we have a list of different things that we're going to cover today. So we have, let's see, what's our handy dandy? Okay, so the list that we have prepared, we're going to cover the Stirges, or nasty little blood-sucking creatures. We are going to go over the Shadow, which kind of represents the undead. We're going to cover a Bugbear, which is a goblinoid race, and a very shocking and surprising one at that. Our star of the show today is going to be the dragon, the adult red dragon. And then we are also going to show different types of nobles and what they can do, how they can add to the game. So, without further ado, I would like to say hello to Lady Shell. Lady Shell, are you in the house?
I am in the house. Hello, Leroon. How are you doing this Sunday?
I'm doing okay. Was really excited when I was prepping this thing with you yesterday. I'm anxious to get into this and show people, or at least give them some good information as to how they can use their NPCs a little bit better in their games. So without that, I think the game gets a little stale, and I think we need to bring up the fact that these creatures have a life of their own. They have a personality. They might even have a name, and they do have some sort of historical importance in your campaign. And today, Lady Shell is playing Amber Frostbeard. Can you tell us a little bit about Amber?
Amber Frostbeard is from Citadel Adbar. She is a dwarven cleric, level 4, if that matters. Um, and yeah, she's good with the Warhammer. She's got a +1 Warhammer, and yeah, she's a pretty good cleric. So hopefully, if I get injured, I'll be able to heal myself.
So we're going to use Amber to kind of illustrate some of the tactics in part two. So when we film part two, we're going to show some of the tactics that some of these creatures might employ, and we're going to use the red dragon throughout this whole series to kind of, you know, put forward the information that we're trying to give you. But I think we're going to start off with these Stirges today. Um, we're not really going to show combats necessarily, but we're going to talk about the stat block and the different aspects in this first segment. So the first creature we want to go over is the Stirge. So the Stirge is not a very pleasant creature. It has a lot of different features that are kind of disturbing. So when you're using Stirges and you have more than one, they can be a real nuisance. Usually there's a few of them. So where there's one, there's probably more, unless it's captured or maybe got lost from its group. They're not very big. They're maybe the size of a bird or something like that. Uh, Potentially maybe crow size. But regardless of their size, they're pretty nasty. They have a decent armor class because they have a pretty quick dexterous movement, and they fly at 40 feet per round. So they are pretty nasty as far as movement. They have dark vision, so their dark vision is able to allow them to attack in the dark. So darkness doesn't bother them. But their nastiest, most heinous is their blood drain and what they can do. So the tactics on these things are really, really gruesome. So the creature looks like a large bat and a mosquito. It has these like nasty looking picture like mouth. I'm gonna bring this up. Here's a photo of it.
It's
And
a proboscis.
yeah, a big proboscis snout. And it has sharp pincers and it has a long needle-like proboscis that slashes the air as it seeks its next meal. Sturges feed on the blood of living creatures, attaching and draining them slowly. Although they pose little danger in small numbers, packs of sturges can be a formidable threat, reattaching as quickly as their weakening prey can pluck them off. So they're like little blood-sucking creatures. They have a blood drain attack. So a sturge attacks by landing on a victim. They find a vulnerable spot, so even like in between your armor, and they plunge its proboscis into the flesh while using its pincher legs to latch on to the victim. Once the surge has sated itself, it detaches and flies off to digest its meal. So, as a game master, these can be a nightmare to run if you have more than a few of them. So, if you're going to run more than 3 or 4 at a time, I would put them in waves. So, on the combat tracker, if you're using Fantasy Grounds, I would do them in groups of 3 or 4 so that you don't get confused and don't bring them in all at once. I would save the first round, bring in 4, second round, bring in a couple more, and just keep building it up. That way you can more easily track how many have fed, because once they get to a certain amount of feeding, they get very they get satiated. And Lady Shell has done some research with me, and we were able to go to the Monsters Know, which is a website, and they talk about some of the tactics that the creatures um, tend to employ. So they have a very pitiful strength. Their dex is high. It's kind of like makes them kind of a more of a hit and run type of attack. So they don't hit and fly attackers. They kind of hit and run. They can waddle along at 10 feet per round, but they fly really fast, like 40 feet per round. So with a wisdom of only 8, they're really not discriminate in how their target selection is. So they'll attack whoever comes close. So they attack the closest to them, and they're barely cognizant with an intelligence of 2. So they only know one way to attack, and they stick with it regardless of the circumstances. The attack really evolves around their feeding when they use their blood drain feature. They start from a position in the air. They dive down to bite in and to latch on with its mosquito-like proboscis. If it hits, it attaches on it, latches onto the victim. It kind of holds on for dear life. So at the start of each round or turn, its victim hasn't if the victim hasn't been able to pull them off, it automatically will drain another 1d4 plus 3 hit points. So if you got 3 or 4 of these little suckers on you, it's definitely gonna yank these it's really gonna yank some blood out of you. And it's a nasty creature, so it can drain your blood really fast. So if you got a few of them, it's gonna drain you quick. So the DM has to keep track of the number for each Stirge individually, and that's where it can be challenging to run creatures like this. So that's why I say do it in waves, so you know that this group went on round A and this group went on round B. And when you're creating an encounter, especially if you're using like Fantasy Grounds, you're going to want to create more than one encounter. So if you're going to do that, I would say in the encounter area, when you bring up your encounter, I would do them like Group A, Group B, Group C, and label those groups like that, so you know that this Stirge is from Group A, this Stirge is from Group B, just so you can help you keep track of which creature is feeding and which one has already fed, and then which ones that haven't. So that way you can keep track of the blood draw that's coming off your PCs. So I think that this is a really nasty creature. It's not very powerful. It only has 2 hit points. But if your players get overwhelmed with them, I think you could have a TPK if you have more than a dozen of them. So once the victim is drained of 10 hit points, the Stirge will be sated and it will detach itself and fly away. Potentially, it'll incur an opportunity attack if it leaves. Because once they're full, they're full. They can't do anything else. Um, Note that in the wording of their blood drain feature, it says a Stirge detaches after it drains 10 hit points or the target dies. Not. So, or the target falls unconscious. In other words, the Stirge keeps slurping up your blood even if you fall to 0. So that means that an automatic failed death save on the part of the victim, which might be you, if you take any damage while you have 0 hit points, you suffer a death saving throw failure. If the damage equals or exceeds your maximum hit point in the negative value, you suffer instant death. And that's in the player's handbook, page 197. So if you ever doubted the ferocity of these things, they're pretty nasty. These little blighters are tenacious, maybe fatally so. So especially for entry level players. So if a Stirge misses its attack, then it flies back up in the air, holding about 20 feet above its target, and then it tries again on its next turn. Then it's a standard attack cycle, like fly down, attack, then either latch on a hit or fly back up on a miss. So Sturges aren't very bright. They have just enough savvy to know that they get less tasty blood if they have to share a victim. So thus their nearest potential target already has another Stirge attached to it. A Stirge will pass it by and attack the second nearest target. Only when other Stirges have latched on to every other living being in the vicinity will they begin to double and triple up. So half an artery is better than none. Sturges are evolved creatures, and they really do have a normal survival instinct. But they're also very fragile. So any damage sufficient enough to seriously injure a Sturge is also sufficient enough to kill it outright. Thus, retreat isn't something you need to concern yourself when you're running an encounter like this. At least, not in the part of the Sturges. They'll definitely pursue opponents who try to retreat, though unless and until they've slaked their thirst for blood. So they if they'll stop chasing if they've digested 10 hit points worth of blood. Even though any one Stirge may be well fed, every other Stirge in the flock is going to want its share too. So Sturges have dark vision, and that means that they'll normally be encountered primarily at night or underground. They don't gain anything from hunting in daylight, so pretty much consider them nocturnal. So I would place these little guys maybe around a cavern or some sort of dungeon area, or if it's indoors, like in an urban setting, maybe in an abandoned house or like a fireplace, maybe an old fireplace that doesn't see any flame anymore, or an attic, crawl space, somewhere where bats would probably hang out would be a good thing. That would make it so that you would have the opportunity to, to surprise people or scare them. Even if it was in a like maybe they got trapped behind a doorway or something, kind of like bats. I think I would kind of treat them like how you would bats. And like I said, I wouldn't do more than a dozen of them on a full group of party members. That would take a lot of time. I think to do it in waves of 4, so maybe if you have 12 of them, you do it in 2 or 3 waves, so it's not like a huge amount on the combat tracker at once. So I would wait a couple rounds before, 1 or 2 rounds before introducing the next wave. That way you can manage your the combat tracker much easier. And then as far as their environment, I mean, think about it. You're going to have, you know, 100 different of these things and try to run all those. That would be ridiculous. So you want to have, an area for them to be in. I would make it a planned encounter as opposed to a random. I think that would be really tough to run as a random encounter, especially if you don't have any control over the quantity. So you want to make sure that you do these in waves if you can help it. So that's my suggestion with them. Also, when you're presenting these creatures, make sure that you kind of describe the sounds and perhaps maybe even some smell, maybe like old irony smell, which would be dried blood. Try to use those elements in your storytelling and in your description of them. Because really, to be honest, if you're in the dark and if you don't have dark vision or you only have a torch, you're not going to see a whole lot of them at first. And one of the things we want to go over in these classes is to describe what they do. Don't tell us what they do. A lot of DMs, including myself, are victims of that. So rather than saying, in a cavern, you see these bat like creatures and they come dropping down and chase after you. That's not too bad, but I think it would be better served that if you describe their location and where they're at a little bit more in depth. So you could say, inside of a dark cavern, you hear the rustling sounds of flapping wings, and you smell the like a faint odor of iron in the air. And anyone who knows what blood smells like knows that it smells a little bit irony. It kind of has a metallic smell to it. And the winged sounds might make the party assume they're bats, which they may proceed and they wouldn't even think about it. And then once they get inside the cavern and they realize there's no bat guano inside the cave, they might go, "What the hell is it?" And then you take a round or two for these sturges to drop down and look for their targets, and then start doing your initiative rolls. By just telling us how they look and then showing this photo right away, kind of destroys the stress of the moment. It kind of immediately alerts your party that there's going to be a fight, and you don't always have to use these creatures to battle the characters. I like to fool around with especially experienced players. When they see a Stirge, they know it's no good. So you don't necessarily have to have these creatures attack them. You can say something like, if once they understand what they're fighting, you could tell the players that yes, these are Sturges, and you have fought these before. They are swarming around looking for their next victim. You can feel their little claws like pull and rake at your hair and your helmets. And you can give them that creepy feeling like having bats dive down on your head. I don't know if you've experienced that, but I went camping once and I kept feeling this weird feeling above me at my head. And I couldn't figure out what it was. And then when my mom went to the restroom, in the light, I was able to see the bats were dive bombing us in the air. So they were sensitive to sonar, so they thought that our hair was probably insects or something. They're diving down on us. Another cool trick with these kind of creatures for tactics is I covered myself at one point in an adventure with a burlap sack. So I had a bag in my inventory, and I told the DM, or I asked him if that could be a burlap made sack. And he was like, sure, whatever. So when the Sturges came down to attack me, I covered myself with this burlap, and they would latch onto it. And then I was able to grab more than, two or three of them at a time, and I would just smother them and crush them. So that's how I deal with them. It's basically like a net. You grab a something like that where their claws get stuck in it, and then you could just take care of them from there. So that's a way. That's a player tactic that they can use to potentially battle these creatures. But I wouldn't offer that information right up front. That's just a creative way of dealing with these things. I know that bats, when they fly down and they dive bomb you, you can take an old nylon stocking and fill it with old socks. And if you throw it up in the air and there's enough bats in the area, they'll latch onto it and they'll get stuck. Their claws get stuck in it, and the weight of the the sack or whatever you throw up or the stocking will fall down. They'll be attached to it. So that is my take on Sturges. So use the environment. The darkness is one thing, and if you have dark vision, it doesn't necessarily mean you can see all the details. So if they're far enough away, you might be able to see, objects flying around, but you don't necessarily know they're Sturges right off the bat. I would actually make the players roll some sort of nature check or maybe a survival check or even history just to see if they actually know what these things are. If they do an investigation check inside of the cavern, maybe they do recognize the droppings, and they might be similar to bats, but they're probably a little different. But I mean, those are different things that you can use to introduce these creatures, and you want to appeal to the senses. So don't just use vision and sight. You see, you see, you see. I always hear that. I don't hear enough. You feel, or you smell, or you hear. You always pretty much rely on sight when you're describing these things. And I think it is because it's a habit, it's a challenge to re-engineer how you think. And also, there isn't always examples or cases where you can use those other senses. So it's okay to use sight, but I wouldn't use that as your main thing until you want them discovered. So if you're gonna introduce something like this, I would make it mysterious, kind of spooky. I would build up to the attack. I would at least have a couple rounds where there was nothing happening, but you can hear the sounds of the wings, and then start your initiative. Um, I don't see these creatures as, cunning ambushers. I think they would just be hanging around, and once something was within their sight or their smell, they would take flight, and then they would start circling around and then attack. So I think they would basically just take a couple rounds to spin up. So if that's the case, that gives your players a chance to react. It gives them a chance to do their buffing spells if they think it's necessary, and it could be a good way to get you to loot to use their spells for no reason. If you want to be a rotten DM, you can have your players get all ready for these things, and then just have them get scared away, or perhaps you just pass through a room and shut a door and they're done. So that could be a very really dishonest way to deter your party from overreacting to your your descriptions and your encounters. So, Lady Shell, what do you think about that Stirge? I'm hoping that Lady Shell's still with me. Push to talk, maybe? Are you there? Maybe she's engaging with the community. So, anyone else have any comments about the Stirge? Okay, Lady Shell. I was just wondering if why there was silence. Yes, maybe she's scared in the silence. Yeah, she probably doesn't like the Sturges. I was just wondering if she was in the voice chat. I haven't heard from her in a while. Did you forget about push to talk, maybe? Anyways, yeah. So I think that it's important to give, and you need to give your NPC just as much life, if not more. You don't hear anything now. Does anybody hear anything? Um, Kanala or Fred, you guys able to hear us, voice wise? Huh. Hmm. Okay, that's good. All right, Lady Shell, you might have to reconnect to um, Discord. That might be what's going on. So just disconnect from Discord and reconnect, and we'll probably get you back. Okay, so yeah, yeah. So yeah, the idea of teaching players not overreacting or goading them into overreacting so they can deplete their spells and their resources. So there's different ways that you can use this encounter to get your point across. I think it's very very, very detrimental to your party if they use up all their spells and their resources on Stirges. But if there's enough Stirges, they're going to have to do something. And the idea of blasting them with the fireball sounds great, but they're usually in a confined area, so that may not be a thing. But nonetheless, use these Stirges sparingly. Don't announce to roll initiative right away all the time. You don't always have to have a fight. So you can scare your party away and make it so where that they can just uh, have a really tough time with them. They did use a few spells to get rid of them, and the next they fight hammered us really hard. Yeah. So that's what they are. You can use them to soften up your party if you think they're too overpowered. That's a good way to use those. All right, good, Shell. So, Shell, what do you think of the Sturges? You have any comments on them?
Um, I don't even know if you're gonna hear me because I'm buffering so bad.
I
I
do
don't
hear you.
understand.
I do hear you.
Yeah, but don't I sound like a robot? Because you're
Nope.
sounding like a robot to me.
No, I hear you loud and clear. Okay.
Yeah, Sturges are nasty.
All right. The Sturges are, yeah, they said your voice sounds good in the chat. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next encounter, or the encounter type, which is another NPC. So Lady Shell actually helped me pick these out. So that was a pretty good find. Thank you, Shell. That was good. Okay, so let's see. The next is, let's go with the Shadow. So here's your favorite, the Shadow. So the Shadow is a form of undead. Now they're not super powerful, but they do have a lot of surprising events around them. So let's take a look at what they can do. So shadows are basically non-corporal. So I think that shadows are something that people kind of misuse. They're very interesting as a low-level undead creature. Um, the shadow is kind of not used a lot. People use zombies and skeletons like crazy. I think the shadow is an underused thing. I kind of like them because they're non-corporal, so they're a little bit harder to hit. I think they're great for like using in horror campaigns, in deep subterranean dungeons, and other creepy settings. But the shadow's compulsion, or its claim to fame, is to siphon the vitality from living beings. So they want to siphon out your living energy from your body, especially from those of pure heart. So shadows pretty much try to avoid light. They particularly direct sunlight, they hate that. It actually gives them disadvantage on everything if they're in direct sunlight. So running into an open sun is the only sure way to escape from shadows. So if you're a party needing to get out of Dodge, try to find some sunlight. Um, Another thing is it has this a feature where it's amorphous. So it can technically pass through cracks under a door or through a keyhole. Wherever there's a small little feature like that, they can get into it. So they do have some substance to them, but it's almost like a blob. But it's still shadowy. It's not actually material. But they do have to have some. They can't go through walls, but they can go through cracks and such. They have a pretty good stealth. As a bonus action, it can hide in dim or light, and for dim light or darkness. And not only that, but they have a high stealth proficiency. So that really makes it so they can really surprise your party and sneak up on them. And they have a lot of resistances to all sorts of damage. So that includes normal weapons. They have outright immunity to most debilitating conditions. Its sole weakness is radiant damage. So if anyone in your party is like a cleric or perhaps a paladin, uh, that would be their juiciest victim. So I would think if you were playing this type of creature, that creature is going to be attracted to the most good-hearted individual. They would probably want to take out that person first. Or if he or she is the only one who's best equipped to defeat it. So that would be the other thing. The stealth proficiency and shadow stealth are together, they're defined as the shadow's tactics. So first, what it normally would do is it would lie in wait for a victim. When one appears, it will use its movement and its bonus action to approach with stealth to within the range of the reach of the target, then hide. If the hide action is successful, then it attacks the same round with advantage using Strength Drain as an action. If the hide action is not successful, it keeps moving to try again the next round. The beauty of this tactic is even if the PC spot this particular shadow, then you can say as the DM, you saw a shadow move past you. And the fact that the shadow is a creature may not even occur to the players initially. All they'll know for sure is that something is there. So again, you can use the darkness, the shadows, the creepy factor in order to get the hackles of your players to get kind of spooked out, and they'll know something's up. They'll be on high alert.
Got a question
Sure.
there. Okay, Canella wants to know, does luring them into sunlight remove any resistance?
Resistances on their behalf or resist
On the mobs, I guess.
um I wouldn't think so. I think it just gives them disadvantage on everything. That's what it does. Yeah, that's still an integral part of what they are. It's just if they're in direct sunlight, it basically they'll move away from the sunlight, and if they can't, they'll be at disadvantage regardless of what they do.
Got it. Thanks.
Yep. So there's nothing about it removing anything. It just says that they have disadvantage in sunlight. And that applies to saves and attacks and everything. So the other thing is, once a shadow attacks successfully, it won't be able to hide anymore until it moves out of your view. So it has to move away in order to reuse that. So unless your characters that are playing are foolish enough to stumble around in total darkness without dark vision, that might be a thing. But this is where its compulsion comes into play. So once it latches onto a character, it will try to keep draining that PC strength. So even through slipping away for another surprise attack might be more effective. So they may stage their attacks in groups. So they may do they might attack and then go away for a bit and then come back and attack again. So they may not they may not attack all at once. So they're not that stupid. They kind of have a little bit of a strategy. So that's one thing you can do. But remember to use the shadow sight sparingly. Maybe you get a slight chill when they go by. Um, make sure that they're hidden well and that you have obstacles to keep players from saying, "Oh, I can see in the dark." Well, yeah, you can see in the dark, but you can't see a shadow in a shadow. It really doesn't make sense. It'd be very difficult. It would be difficult to spot. Uh, Plus, they can change their size, so they're not always humanoid shaped. They can be, they can go into a small area and hide underneath a chair or whatever they need to do to exist. But it'll just keep on trying to drain your strength. It'll slip away and try to, attack and be a lot more effective that way. So if you don't just straight up just have it fight toe to toe with somebody, they can be a very deceptive and annoying um, target or a enemy. Probably nothing but radiant damage being struck by a magical weapon or a cleric or paladin's turn undead feature is going to do anything to them. So if one of those is used against it, it will disengage and move out of view. And it will try to hide as a bonus action if it can. And it will wait for its victim to come within striking distance again. So if they get that taste of that type of deterrent, they will back off. So strength drain can be nasty, not so much because an average 9 hit points of necrotic damage it does, so it automatically deals an average of 9. So it does, with each hit, it does 1d4 reduction of strength each time it hits, and the abilities will be gone, potentially affecting your character's attack and damage rolls. So I think in Fantasy Grounds, you would have to just manually adjust the character's um, strength if you don't have the right coding. And if you do have the right coding, the spell is coded right, I think it can temporarily reduce the strength as an effect. So in face-to-face table, you would just have to know that. You'd have to make the adjustments and put in the applicable penalties and that, so on and so forth. So that is not a good thing. So the once that happens, you start losing your ability to use your weapons and certain armors and such. So it affects that. It affects your damage, your attack rolls, and your ability to use certain weapons, and also heavy armor will become too heavy. You can't wear it. So until a player completes a short or long rest, and if your character is reduced to 0 hit points, he or she will die on the spot. So the PC doesn't simply fall unconscious, they actually die. Skeletons and zombies have long since lost any ability they had to frighten players. But an encounter with one of these shadows should definitely terrify them. So I encourage you not to overlook this monster as a potential low-level undead encounter. They are devious. They go after the stronger, more goodly characters, and they are definitely attracted to this light, and they want to do everything they can to drain this this vitality from a paladin or a cleric or somebody that's very good in the party. I think that's how they would prioritize their targets. And usually there's
I have a
more than one.
question.
Okay.
Oh, my question was like you said, if your strength is drained and you were wearing an armor that had um, a prerequisite of strength of 13 or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember which
Yep.
one. I think is it the um, shoot.
Any
It's
heavy
not,
armor is going to be like
yeah, the
13.
heavy armor ones. Anyway, would that mean that the character would have to like to take its armor off, or is it going to have like will it reduce the movement to 0? What would happen?
Your a lot of disadvantage would happen. Because you may not have time to take off your armor. So the
That's
best way to
very lengthy.
yeah, the way to adjudicate that would be just to apply disadvantage on the character, and you could force that in their stat block in Fantasy Grounds. So you can put stealth disadvantage automatically. You can also take their armor class and reduce it down so that it's actually not as effective. There's all kinds of different things you can do to kind of to proceed with that. It's kind of left up to the DM. You can also just describe it. So rather than worrying about all the mechanics, you can just say you can't do that, but you can describe what's happening. So you could say you feel overwhelmed, all of a sudden you're exhausted, you're chilled to your bone, you have this feeling of a dark doubt, like you feel like you're being caved in on, you're feeling claustrophobic, you're worried that these shadows are going to pop up, you're afraid to sleep. There's all these little after effects that happen once you've encountered a shadow. So shadows are not fun to deal with. They are low level, but generally there's two or more in an area. I rarely see one. It's usually at least two or more. That doesn't mean there can't be one. It just simply means that depending on the size of the party and what you're trying to achieve in this encounter can be dictated by, how powerful you want to make it. So if you do like four of them, that's pretty tough. I would think at a lower level, I think two would be enough. If you wanted to do like a mid-level encounter, maybe four. And if you want to do a high level encounter, maybe 10 or 12 or more. So it just depends on the strengths and weaknesses of your party. But as far as size and managing in Fantasy Grounds or any other virtual tabletop, I would think that, groups of 2 would be good, or maybe groups of 3. But if you have a party of 5 and you have 4 shadows, that's going to still be pretty tough for them, even if they're not high level. So you have to consider that even though their CR level's low and that they don't have a lot of hit points, what they can do to your party is really powerful. So you have to gauge, how long do you want this encounter to last and all the different things you're going to have to handle when it comes to this particular encounter. And like Lady Shell said, how do you handle the armor if it becomes useless? How do you track, when they go to 0 hit points, what do you have to do to fix that or make that happen? So that could be a thing. I would even say that if they went to 0 and they die, they themselves might return as a shadow. So that would be kind of cool if one of your players died and they were not consecrated when they died and they were
I
just
think it
left.
says that in the document
Yeah, let's take
that
a
if
look.
the person, yeah, I remember reading.
So it says, let's see the shadow. So I'm looking on the stat block of a particular, here's the shadow stat block. And let's see, it can move through a 1-inch wide area or as narrow as 1 inch. When it's in dim light, it can take hide as a bonus action. While in sunlight, it has disadvantage on attacks, ability checks, and saving throws. And then it talks about its melee attack and its necrotic damage. So the damage does 2d6 plus 2. And then if the strength target is reduced to 0, then it dies. But a new shadow rises from the corpse 1d4 hours later. So there you go. So if you have NPCs and you're in another virtual tabletop, or even if you're playing around the table, take the time to read about the lore about your creatures. And, you'll have up photos. Something like this comes with the monster manual, kind of gives you an idea of how they kind of creep up on people. Um, Also, if you're playing face to face or if you're in Fantasy Grounds, you can change the mood lighting. So if you're in the dark, you can actually change the background to kind of reflect, kind of a darker mood. Just changing the lighting alone does a lot. And then use like music if you have it available, if you know how to do it. That will help you set the mood for these encounters. So that's another thing, when you're describing this encounter, if you set the mood right away, your characters are going to know it's dark and it's ominous without even saying anything. I mean, that really says, okay, it's dark at the minimum. The next thing would be to introduce some music, some creepy words, maybe make some sound effects, some swooshing sounds, whatever it takes to describe this NPC without outright saying, "Okay, this is a shadow. The shadow is attacking you." I mean that is so boring. That makes the game so predictable and so PC and cliche. To try to use more descriptive words that describe things around the actual NPC. So the cold air, the darkness, the the feeling of ominous, that sense of fear and tension. You have to create that in order to deliver these type of, especially with undead and horror. You really want to create that atmosphere. And I would think about doing this quite regularly in a horror campaign. And I don't overdo it. So when you have encounters like this, make sure they count and they have meaning and not just a random ambush. I think for shadows, if you were going to use these as a um, kind of a wandering monster, what I would do is just have 2 of them, have them make an appearance, have them do a strike out, and then take off. I don't think they would always stick around to fight to the death. These are these can be done as hit and run tactics. And if there is a party member that they're attracted to, they'll probably follow them throughout the game and make another strike when it's unopportunistic. So they can show up later and make an attack when you're in the middle of another battle. And maybe at the end, the big boss is a necromancer or somebody you can control undead. So that would even be worse. But nonetheless, use the shadows and don't always use skeletons and zombies. So that is the shadow. Any comments or do you have anything to say, Lady Shell, about the shadow?
Yeah, I ain't afraid of no shadow. I'm a cleric.
Yeah. So they get really weirded out. The shadows, they're different. They want to feed on your vitality. So they are really creepy, actually. So I guess they're like an undead Stirge in a way. Let's see. Let's go to the Bugbear. Now, Bugbears are interesting. They are a goblin race. They are really tough. They are big. They're not tiny. They're considered a medium creature, but I think most of them are over 5'10". I mean, they're tall. And they don't seem to be wimpy in any fashion. They do speak common and goblin. They have stealth and survival. They have dark vision. Good strength, decent dex, decent con, but their intelligence, wisdom, and charisma are on the average side. They're not super smart, but they're not dumb. They're survivalists. So they really try to protect themselves from harm. So here's a picture of one that I'm going to show. And it basically breaks it down into, what they're like. So it says they're born for battle and mayhem. They survive by raiding and hunting. So they're not just attacking just for the hell of it. They want food and they also want territory. They bully the weak, so they do know to look down to others, and they despise being bossed around. So they don't make very good minions. But their love of carnage means they will fight for powerful masters if bloodshed and treasure are assured. So they can be enticed to fight for a more powerful leader. They're usually found in the company of hobgoblins or goblins. Bugbears usually enslave goblins. So if they encounter them, they try to boss them around, and they bully hobgoblins into giving them gold and food in return for serving as scouts and shock troops. So even when paid, bugbears are at best unreliable allies. Yet goblins and hobgoblins understand that no matter how much bugbears might drain a tribe's resources, these creatures are a potent force. So they tend to be kind of brutish in nature. So they follow a god named Hergek. So they worship Hergek, a lesser god who dwells on the plane of Acheron. In their absence of their goblin kin, bugbears form their own loose war bands. Each one would be led by the fiercest member. So they lead by strength and might. Bugbears believe that when they die, their spirits have a chance to fight at Hergek's side. So dying to them isn't as scary as some of the others' races. They try to prove themselves worthy by defeating as many foes as possible. So that makes them pretty fearless. So they also ambush. So technically, they usually hide behind trees or big boulders, and they stand very still. They can be very, very quiet. They don't wear a ton of armor, so they usually use hide or piece armor. They're intimidating. They can move, though, with surprising stealth. So they're very fond of setting ambushes, and they will flee if they're outmatched. Um, they're dependable mercenaries as long as they have supply of food, drink, and treasure. But bugbears often forget any bond when its life is on the line. So if it feels like it's threatened and it's not going to survive, it'll take off. A wounded member of a bugbear band might be left behind to help the rest of the band escape. Afterward, the bugbear might help pursuers track down its former companions if doing so saves its own life. So they're kind of wishy-washy about loyalty, but they are, if you can get them under your thumb, they are pretty tough. As a player, it would be sort of challenging to play a character like that. But if you were exposed to the right things and raised a certain way, I'm sure that some of those characteristics would fade or be less, less dramatic, and it'd be a little bit more conducive to your party. So I think if they're getting their share of the treasure and they're allowed to hunt and to feed without prejudice, I think the bugbear would be a great companion if you choose to include one in your party. Um, they have a very, very how would I say, sneakiness about them for being such a huge creature. So imagine this thing's like Bigfoot. I mean, it's no joke. Um, they are kind of I don't know, they're not really a warlord, but they do have a lot of qualities that are surprising. Let's see. So bugbears, they tend to be the strongest out of their goblinoids, even hobgoblins. So they lack the hobgoblin's intelligence and discipline, but they make up for it in strength and might. So they are pretty healthy. They do a formidable amount of damage. So they have a brute feature, which is basically like landing a crit every time they hit. So that nasty Morning Star, they have a feature that basically lets them roll an extra damage die every time they swing that thing, if they connect. Their surprise attack ability allows them to do like a supernova attack on the first PC they encounter. So they are stealthy, they get that extra damage, and they would get crit damage. So if they roll a critical roll on their attack roll, and they're doing a surprise attack, and they have that feature, they would be pretty nasty. Um, Bugbears are pretty stealthy in most regards, except for maybe bright, broad daylight. So they usually use the terrain or the surrounding areas to help them. So in a city, I don't think they would be as cunning. Maybe they would hide in an alley or something like that. But in a natural wilderness setting, I would think that they would be a very formidable stealth brute. Um, the difference in how they ambush is a little bit different. Goblins kind of engage in like hit and run sniper attacks, whereas bugbears, they'll lie in waiting until someone comes within their range, and then it will basically creep up if the foe comes within 30 feet. Then it springs out and it'll smash you to a pulp. It isn't discriminate in its target selection. However, it will attack whoever first comes within reach of it. Normally, it doesn't distinguish between targets that look weaker and targets that look stronger. To the bugbear, they all look weak. So bugbears normally carry two weapons: a big, heavy morning star and a javelin. So they don't really fear face-to-face confrontation because they know that morning star does a lot of damage. So the only reason for them to use a javelin is if for some odd reason they can't get close enough to whoever they attack. Normally, they don't throw that javelin. So the bugbears are pretty much monsters, more of the roar, bash, bash, bash variety. They pretty much love mayhem. They chase down fleeing opponents if they can. Their survival instinct, however, is powerful. If one of them is hurt seriously, like maybe they're reduced to 10 hit points or lower, they usually get confused and they flee. So they're so surprised that they're getting their asses handed to them, they'll run away. They take the dash action instead of an attack, and they'll potentially expose themselves to an opportunity attack if they have to get out of there. If by some miracle your party captures a bugbear alive, it will be humiliated. It'll be so traumatized and willing to do just about anything to preserve its own life. So they are pretty tough until you get them captured. Then they kind of cower down. There is another variety of this creature that I'm not going to cover everything, but The Bugbear Chief is basically just an exceptional member of their race, usually a leader. They have multi-attack, so more bash, bash, bash. And at the heart of Hrugic's feature, which gives it advantage on saving throws against a variety of conditions. So it has a +2 on intimidation. It is kind of like an orc in that sense. A group of bugbears that are led by a chief would initiate a parley at the beginning of a counter. But since their stealth proficiency is one of the bugbear's advantage, they would blow their cover simply to hurl taunts and threats. So who knows? But bugbear chiefs have an intelligence of 11 and wisdom of 12. So that's not too bad. I mean, that's pretty decent. There can't be many circumstances in which your party and a bugbear chief would have anything of a purposeful conversation. But I think a couple, maybe somehow, the party has managed to surprise the bugbears rather than vice versa. Maybe one side is besieging the other, and they've reached a stalemate. Maybe the PCs are high level enough that the bugbear chief realizes it, and he knows it's going to be a hard fight against them. Yet they still have something the bugbears want. Of course, the bugbear chief's idea of negotiation usually mainly consists of demands, threats, insults, trade this for that, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth type thing. So, um, bugbears are pretty tough. I would use them amongst your goblinoids. I think that would be more ideal than just using them as a group of, uh, you know, combatants, unless there's a small, um, a small group that is traveling in the forest. Maybe they're migrating from one home to the next, or perhaps you stumble upon a lair of them, like a cave or some sort of clearing in the forest. So that is basically my take on those bugbears. And a lot of this tactical information we're getting is from the website called The Monsters Know. So if you're wondering where all this great information is, it's coming from experience, but it's also coming from that source. So Lady Shell, I don't know if you put the that resource in the chat, but it's something worth to look at. And what you want to do is copy and paste um, some of your tactics on the back of your stat block or in your notes section if you're just using pen and paper. It gives you ideas on how to run these NPCs. So I think these kind of encounters would happen with bugbears, like when the sun's going down, or maybe before the sun comes up. I'm not saying they're strictly nocturnal, but I don't see them running around in broad daylight. I think they would be hidden under trees, in caves, behind rocks. I don't think you'd see them running around in a city. And if they were, they'd be hidden or captured. They might also be trained, so they could be a gladiator. That would be another cool um, background for them, as they were raised to be a gladiator. In that case, they might have some manners, but they would still be very brutal. So I'm not sure how you would fit it in with your campaign, but bugbears are definitely cool. They do have a lot of powerful features. And for a low level party, I don't think I would introduce more than 2 at a time. I think they would be too tough for a low level group. So that's anything from 3rd level below. Um, and then if you mix in goblins with that equation, that can be a really nasty encounter. So that's our take on the bugbear. Is there any comments or questions or suggestions or anything about the bugbear? I kind of like the monster. It's pretty cool. And as a player race, I think you'd have to build a pretty decent backstory. So I think a gladiator would make sense, or perhaps you were raised amongst others, or perhaps you were mistreated enough to where you wanted to leave your clan to survive. Maybe you were rescued by a ranger or a druid, or perhaps a young kid had taken a liking to you and didn't realize how dangerous and harmful you were. Maybe you had that moment like you see in a movie where you have a soft place for that one human child or elven child. So it's one of those things where you'd have to make up a really cute or a really awesome story to kind of make it fit in. Any questions or comments on that? Lady Shell, do you have any questions or anything to say about the Bugbear?
Um, Not really. I don't see any questions in the chat, so I guess we'll move on to our next section.
Okay. So our next creature, this is the creature feature of our um, tutorial here, our class. So we're going to feature one of the most, noticeable tropes that are part of the game that we love so much. Um, Also remember, guys, that these tutorials don't have to just apply to one rule set. Some of the advice and some of the tactics and also the tertiary things are what you really want to focus on. They will help you with thinking about how these creatures would tie in with the world that you're developing with your players. And you could totally have something different. You don't have to do what we're telling you. These are just suggestions, ideas, ways to make the creatures actually have a life, a persona. You can even give them names if you want to. I don't know about the Stirges and the Shadows, but the Bugbear Chieftain might have a name. This next dragon that we're going to be demonstrating, there is quite a bit of information on these creatures. So I'm going to pop him up. Basically, the adult red dragon is one of the most iconic creatures in Dungeons and Dragons. This is what puts the dragon in the dungeons, and they are quite well-established creatures. They tend to kind of instill fear in everybody. So they're pretty nasty. There are different varieties of them. They have all kinds of different features that would make them, uh, attractive to make as a big boss or maybe a final boss, perhaps even just to scare people away. So dragons don't always have to be lethal encounters. If you encounter a chromatic dragon, more than likely they're going to pass you by for better prey. However, if you chance upon their lair or a female dragon's nest, or you get in the middle of a dragon trying to accomplish its goals, then you're going to be probably a victim of a dragon. Normally, they don't stop to harass a group of party members unless the party members are known to them or have slighted them. Even silver, the metallic dragons, even though they're good, they still have hunger. They have no problems taking out characters if the characters stand in their way. So dragons that are good tend to reason more, but that doesn't mean they're not going to kill you. So good dragons are just as lethal as evil ones, maybe even more so. Technically, though, they're more forgiving and they will parlay more if you have something important that they want or that they need. But generally, they will give warning before they kill you. And if you don't take that warning, then they will definitely take care of you. So dragons are not that hard to run. As a matter of fact, I have a dragon on the lava island map here. They are pretty large size. They have different stages of growth. And they're all pretty much the same across the board, except for their environment, their lair actions, and their breath weapon. But everything else is kind of the same. So what I'm saying is, let's see, I have some notes here. So let's see. They are definitely a very tough variety of creature to deal with. I would use them sparingly, like I said, maybe a boss, or maybe use them as, something that you want to scare people with. I wouldn't necessarily use them as your dew wall. Um, let's see. So I wanted to touch on this just to get this out of the way. Um, Dragons are pretty much the same across the board, as I mentioned earlier. They all have things in common. So, for instance, they, being dragons, they all have flight at twice their land movement speed. They all have one additional movement ability, depending on their color. They have high strength and con. They have bonuses on the big three saving throws. So Dex, Con, and Wisdom. Also, they have Charisma too. They have proficiency in Perception and Stealth, and Blind Sight and Dark Vision, suited to their subterranean environments. Depending on their dwelling preferences, of course. They begin as uncomplicated wormlings. As they grow older, they gain more and more abilities and features as they age and grow. So if you encounter a wormling as opposed to a young adult dragon, you're going to have a slightly different experience. But they all have breath weapons in common. The last feature is their most defining characteristic. So dragons, even wormlings, have a breath weapon. And the effects depend on the color, of course. So the breath weapon itself is pretty much their most powerful damage. Usually it's a big cone-shaped area of effect, except for blue and bronze dragons, they have lightning, which is linear. Because of its power, it has to recharge. So in Fantasy Grounds, that's set automatically usually. You have to roll a 5 or a 6 every round to see if it has access to its breath weapon. So on the average, if you're running these guys, just keep in mind that usually the dragon will use its breath weapon once every 3 turns, but dice are fickle. Sometimes they roll favorably, sometimes they don't. Taking high strength and constitution as indicative of a brute profile, a tough creature with strong preference for toe-to-toe fighting. So they do kind of do that. Most dragons are brutes, even in the wormling stage. Of the chromatic dragons, pretty much black and green wormlings lack the constitution to take on any newcomer in battle. So they one-on-one they might be okay, but if they have more than one attacker, wormlings probably will try to be more stealthy. So despite their strength, they may prefer to simply use their stealth to avoid combat unless they're attacked first. Dragons of every other color and age won't hesitate to directly get up into your grill. So they will, they'll fight. They're not chicken. Let's see. When it's seriously wounded, so let's say your dragon is down to about 40% of its hit points or less, it tends to hightail it. So they don't always stick around and fight to the end. If its life is too valuable, if that's how it feels, and it will, to risk on foes capable of doing so much harm to it, it will flee. However, between being moderately wounded, like 70%, like you lose 30% or something like that, or being seriously wounded, different types of dragons react differently to the situation. So, for instance, white dragons are really dense and truculent, so they'll simply just keep fighting. Red dragons are very wrathful and arrogant, so they also will keep fighting. The other ones might back off, or they might retreat, or they might leave you with a little nasty prize, but they generally are smarter to kind of move away. So let's talk about legendary actions. Now, I'm not going to cover all the legendary actions for every single creature, but I'm going to mention them here and there for comparison. So dragons have legendary attacks and lair actions. So in this case, a fire-breathing dragon, which we have here on this battle map, it can basically knock enemies prone across a huge radius or poison and incapacitate them. So knocking enemies prone is good against melee type opponents. Poison is good against all other opponents making ranged or melee attacks, and incapacitation shuts a PC down completely. But if you really want to get the best effect out of it, you will aim it at all PCs with the richest action economy. So if you want to use the legendary actions, try to get your characters or mess with the ones that have more um, bonus actions like rogues and things like that. Maybe bards, especially those with the access to bonus actions and or extra attacks or reactions. So those are the ones that you want to go after. So that's just a suggestion for tactics. All damaging lair actions are good against, well, anybody within range. So if you think about it, they're good to go-tos for softening up the PCs when no other lair action seems more useful. So young adult dragons or young dragons, also shown as adolescent variations of their adult personalities. So they show basically a similar attitude as their parents. So, for instance, young black dragons are snarling bullies. Young blue dragons are preening narcissists. Young green dragons are very cocky, they're kind of hustlers. Young red dragons are very arrogant punks. And young white dragons, barely articulate predators. So they do kind of have the features of their parents. Let's see. So in this case, we have an adult red dragon, and this is where they get interesting because after the wormling and the young adult, they start becoming a lot more powerful. And this is when they start gaining their legendary stuff. So as legendary creatures, this means they get legendary actions and lair actions. So this can have a very game-changing effect on action economy. So lots of new toys they get to play with. So chromatic dragons have lair actions that fall into three rough categories. You have movement restrictors. So this would include like a black dragon's grasping tide, which can knock PCs prone. A blue dragon will collapse a ceiling down on the players, which will basically bury them under rubble. The green dragon has these grasping roots, which will restrain the characters. And the red dragon has a tremor, like an earthquake, which can also knock players prone. And the white dragon, of course, has like a wall of ice that will block you. Now, when they do direct damage, this is the third type. This one includes the black dragon, he has swarming insects. The blue dragon has arc lightning. The green dragon has this thorny brush type growth. And the red dragons have magma eruptions. And then, of course, the white dragon will rain ice shards down on you. So these are some really nasty direct damage that they can do as their lair actions and such. And then the debilitators are pretty nasty. So this would be like the black dragon's darkest sphere. Blue dragons have a cloud of sand. The green dragons have this enchanting fog. And the red dragons use volcanic gas, whereas white dragons have freezing fog. So those are some of the things that they employ as they become legendary. So adult dragons on up get those special attacks. So all dragons, such as chromatic and metallic alike, they have the same set of legendary actions available to them. So two of them are attacks. So that's a tail attack and a wing attack. Tail attacks are sufficient reach to hit anyone within 15 feet away from them. So that's kind of good for range. Whereas the wing attack will affect up to 10 feet away, but it costs two legendary actions. So it depends on your action economy, how many actions you have, and what you want to do. They have different costs. Because of this cost, and the fact that a wing attack does slightly less damage than the tail attack, though it also has a very high probability of knocking targets prone, it's generally not worth using against one PC. And two would be a borderline case. So as soon as a third PC or more comes within 10 feet of an adult dragon, though its wing attack time or its wing attack time. So when you have, more than two PCs or maybe two or more, then you use your wing attack. After attacking, it will use its bonus fly movement to basically resuscitate itself and resituate itself so it's no longer being flanked or surrounded if you use the flanking rules. A dragon also uses wing attack after a melee attack has seriously injured it. So if it gets hurt, like down to 40% of its hit points or less, in order to knock its opponents or attackers prone so that they will have disadvantage on attacks, including opportunity attacks, and use the bonus flying movement to initiate its escape. So that is a way it can egress or escape the battle. The tail attack is a freebie the dragon can use against a PC impertinent enough to try to sneak up on it from behind. It won't really do this twice in a round unless there's no chance of it being surrounded by 3 attackers, and it might need to make a wing attack before its own turn. So the tail attack is kind of a reserved thing for rear ambushers or maybe as a kind of a surprise attack. So the lore on red dragons, they are referred by sages as Conflagratio Horribilis. So these dragons tend to have a lot of lore centered around them. We kind of discussed some of their tactical stuff. Now the lore part of it is what we're focusing on, and that has to do with the fact that these red dragons are very powerful. They're kind of cliche. You see them in a lot of movies. A lot of fantasy tropes have red dragons in them. So in order to help that, to get away from that, it's important that you give them a name. In this case, I stole the name from, I believe it was Dragonlance. We call this red dragon Ember. So he has a name. It kind of goes with his personality. So red dragons, basically, they're covetous, they're evil, they're interested only in their own well-being. So variety and basically also their extension of their treasure hoard. So they don't care about anything but their vanity and their treasure and their own needs. Um, they're supremely confident of their own abilities, but they're prone to making snap decisions without any forethought. So they can get a little bit in trouble if that happens. They are fearsome. They're very cruel. They're probably the worst ones out of all the chromatic dragons. They breathe a big cone of fire. Dragons usually delight in ruin, death, and destruction. So red dragons are totally into that. They're physically distinguished by their enormous size and wingspan. So a full-grown adult is pretty huge. They have two large horns or more on the top of their heads, which normally point backwards toward their wings. And usually they smell of smoke and sulfur. So one of the things you can do when you're running these dragons is run that sense by your players. So they might see the shadow of the dragon, so not actually the dragon, but they'll see its shadow block out the sun or the light source. And then later on, maybe 10 minutes later, they might smell smoke and sulfur come in through the wind. So that may give the party a sense of, uh-oh, there's, this drama coming up. Another way I use dragons is to break up big fights. If you have a nasty fight that's happening and you don't like the way it's going, bring a dragon by. He doesn't have to land. You can simply just cast a shadow, or maybe you see him off in the distance. Maybe even hear him, roaring or something, or blasting their food from a distance. That may be enough fear and enough worry to scatter that battle that's happening that's not going well. So if your party is fighting some bugbears and then all of a sudden the battle is turning against them, bring out a dragon, you know? Bring in the dragons. They don't even have to attack. They can do a flyby to investigate what's happening, and the bugbears might be superstitious and take off. So they know that dragons are no joke. They're survivalists, so they may take off just to preserve themselves. So you can use dragons in more of a storytelling element as opposed to an actual villain. There's all kinds of reasons why dragons, are used in storytelling. Usually ends up in a fight though, but not always. You might even meet them much later on in your campaign, or maybe you find out that they were actually being nice and trying to make sure that you reach them so that they can talk to you. Who knows? But there are other things you can do with dragons other than just put them right up against your players. Um, they're usually the most used trope in fantasy and books and movies and all kinds of media, but they are an important aspect of the game. Um, Pretty much like most dragons, they will live their life in cycles of activity and hibernation. So quite often you'll see dragons are sleeping or perhaps they're resting. Normally, this is not because they're taking a nap. Their naps consist of 5 to 10 years. So when they go to sleep, it's in years, not days or months. So they live cyclical in rhythms, and sometimes the green dragons they sleep for a long time. Red dragons kind of seal themselves inside their lair and spend upwards of about 10 years at a time. So they'll take a nice little nap for 10 years. A lot of things can happen in human terms, but for them, they kind of spend their time resting and thinking and, counting their treasure and stuff. They don't always fly around and attack. So during their active periods, though, they're very, very voracious over hunters. So their hunger will basically ensure that populations of any nearby creatures will not grow beyond ecological stability. So they'll thin the herd out for you in a heartbeat. Um, so in legends, fairy tales, and fables that speak of dragons, without specifying any specific color, will always usually tell of a kingdom laid waste, a virtuous maiden sacrificed, a valiant hero that was sent home as charred corpses, or that they are to speak of the mighty red dragons. So often they're called flame dragons, fireworms, and mountain dragons. So these horrific beasts, they epitomize the iconic dragon traits. So the red dragon is one of those. Very iconic. Um, the fact that dragons are predators, but reds are pretty much the uber hunter, very voracious, and they consume far more than they require. They're very greedy, and they're avaricious beyond any point of reason. So they fully believe that all wealth belongs to those strong enough to take it, and no amount of wealth is ever enough. So all dragons are prideful, but reds are very arrogant in the extreme. They see themselves as the pinnacle of dragon perfection. Red dragons never forget even the smallest slight. They kill over territorial intrusion, over the tiniest theft from their hoard. So even one little coin pisses them off. And over an insult, maybe even. If someone says, "Oh, you're not as big and tough as you think you are," they get pretty mad about that. Or they might just kill just because they want to. These great beasts take satisfaction wherever and however they can get it. So a red dragon, unable to slay a person who offends it, will go on a rampage. They'll wreak havoc, destroy things in nearby communities, whatever it takes to get their point across. Only enormous monetary tributes can sate the legendary rage of a red dragon, and only blood can cool and drown that rage. Red dragons are not mindlessly violent, however. Accomplished strategists, they spend their time developing vast arrays of tactics for use in every conceivable combat scenario. They recognize the hazards in attacking more potent foes, although rare such foes might be. They back down from fights if they don't believe they can win, though doing so will wound their pride to the bone. So red dragons are not something to take slightly. So they tend to have a very powerful impact on a game. So there's some regional effects that happen. For instance, once a dragon takes up a lair, there are some regional effects that can take place, especially if it's a legendary dragon. The area becomes kind of warped by the dragon's magic. So it creates one or more of the following effects. So there might be small earthquakes. Water might become supernaturally warm and tainted by sulfur. Rocky fissures within a mile of the dragon's lair will form portals to the elemental plane of fire, allowing creatures of elemental fire into the world to dwell nearby. And if a dragon dies, these effects will fade over a course of 1d10 days. So those sort of supernatural events will sort of subside. So there's all kinds of cool things, but an adult dragon lives anywhere from 100 to 800 years, and they are considered huge. So in size comparison, they are large creatures. They are very, very, very large. So yes, a huge dragon. That's basically how big they are. So any questions or comments about the dragon? I see he can speak common and draconic. It is a challenge rating 17 creature worth 180,000 experience. No,
Gee, I
18,000.
think Amber could level a bunch of times on that.
Shell and I put together a presentation that we are going to share with you guys. Basically, I'm going to cover one last lore type, and that will tie into our tactics section of it, where we're actually going to show the fantasy grounds side of it, and we are going to use some of this lore of the dragon and the NPCs and the environment to illustrate how we're going to run the encounter and use some of the information that we had provided throughout this lesson. So think sulfur, think flames, rocky mountains, uh, cavernous lairs. We actually have a lava island type lair for this dragon. And think of, this, we called the dragon Ember for the lack of a better name. But think of the different things that you would employ to keep this dragon as part of your story and not make it so cliche. I mean, it's going to have some of the similar aspects, but it's better if you play the dragon like almost like it's a person. Dragons need that extra detail. So if you can play them like a mean person that you knew in your former life as a child, maybe you had a bully that used to pick on you, or maybe you were beat as a child. Think of the person that was harmful and mean and malicious, and you could probably play the red dragon. Let's see. So you draw upon real life experiences sometimes to voice these characters and to give them life. Unfortunately, it's not always positive. So now I have the last group of our NPCs, bringing them to life. So what I've done here is I've created 3 variations of the commoner. So each commoner has a goal or a place in our world. So Lady Shell, do you want to tell us about what those are? You remember the 3 types that we made?
Yeah, we have a lore giver, and we have a quest giver, and we have someone that does the social encounter.
That's right. So these are 3 different types of NPCs. They don't all have to be commoners. I just used that as a template. So what I did is I made a basic commoner, brought up the stat block, I made copies of it, and then each stat block, Lady Shell and I went through these, and we changed them a little bit. So all we did is kind of rearrange their stats a little bit. We gave them some skills. Ideally, in your campaign, you want to give these names. So, Lady Shell, how do we deal with names as a
Well,
role-playing thing?
probably one of the best tips that I've heard about names is to make yourself a list of names, maybe an A through Z list. And then if something comes up during your game, you are prepared with a name from that list and you're not just sputtering, looking like you're not prepared. So I think that's a good tip.
I concur. It's nice to have a list of names ready to go, so you can go into your notes and, you know, try to avoid names like Bob, Joe, Tim. Those are kind of funny, but they're corny as well. Try to think of names that have a meaning to the setting, or at least fit in somehow, even if it is a little bit of comedy to it. So here I have the commoner, the lore giver, the quest giver, and the social encounter. So we're going to talk about the social encounter first. So in no way is this meant to be a know-all, tell-all. This is just an example of how you would use commoners. So most commoners, when you come into a town or some sort of area populated by humanoids, you will see outlying farmers, perhaps travelers along the road, adventurers, things like that. So one of the things we did is change the stats a little bit to reflect this commoner. Now, when a commoner has a good charisma, they're feeling more likely to speak. So we adjusted their charisma up a little bit and gave them, a few stat bumps just in case. So it's really not for combat. This is more for dialogue. So we gave them persuasion, we gave them performance, insight, nature, sleight of hand, deception, history, and survival. The reason so many skills is it depends on how you're going to use this commoner. So in this case, you could use this for a few different types of encounters. So social encounter is mainly just discussion, but it also could be a storekeeper. This could be a guy that's willing to guide you around the city. This could just be someone you're sitting next to in a bar. It could be basically anything that's not really giving you a quest or anything that's giving you some actual lore. So we're talking rumors. So not just, stuff that's tied into the setting, but it may be tied in personally to them, which may indirectly tie into the setting, but it doesn't actually have a lot of value. Now that's up to you as a game master and the players how you want to treat and use these commoners. But the first one we're going over is the social encounter. So in the social encounter, basically, this is where the RP comes in RPGs. So as we said, the dragon has his personality and such. A lot of your NPCs should act like they would in real life. So other than just having names, you might have a personality table. So a personality, a name, and perhaps even a small description of what they might look like. You can either do that ahead or you can make tables that'll roll those for you so that you can quickly attach it to one of your commoners or one of your NPCs. You don't even need a stat block necessarily, but it's nice to have one so you can take notes. So for instance, I unlocked this encounter and I put examples. So the barkeep, city guard, storekeeper, a guide, a minder, a performer, or a street urchin might be examples of this. So the social encounters are more about role playing to kind of slowly introduce the feeling or the direction that you want your campaign to go, the ambiance, so to speak, based on how they're dressed and how they approach you and what they offer in dialogue is up to your DM. But here are some things that we kind of compiled, and you want to keep track of their name if you can. How do they act when they encounter the players? Do they have certain behavioral dispositions? Like, do they act a certain way in a certain situation? Maybe they're not friendly, who knows? Do they have a purpose to your setting or world? Some will, some won't, but nonetheless, they should touch at least on the local color and the background of where your setting exists or where your encounter takes place. So you would have a list of names in case your players meet NPCs that you were not ready for. So these are the NPCs that are not in your module, and you need to use them to either direct the party along, to introduce some comedy, or we call that comic relief. So in case there's been a lot of heartache and damage and fighting, you can always throw in a good NPC to kind of cheer things up. Also, you can use them to give out some riddles or puzzles. Generally, those stay with quest givers, but occasionally social encounters would give out jokes, riddles, or puzzles. Nothing too serious or detrimental to the game, but they may do that if they're, especially if they're like a bard or a performer. Also, you can use them for red herrings. So you have rumor tables that you can use that may or may not pertain to your setting. One of the things we definitely will reinforce during this series is that you do not tell. So learn to describe what is happening. Do not tell us what is being done. So that is a bad habit that a lot of game masters get into, including myself. I find myself saying, "Oh, this guy or this NPC walks over to you and he starts talking to you about the events that are coming up." So that doesn't tell you much of anything. You have an NPC, an empty stat block. He has no name. You don't know what he looks like, and it's really a waste of time, to be honest. And I've done it before. I'm guilty of it. So try to make sure that you have some sort of substance, at least a little bit, for your NPCs. So have descriptions. Be sure to give them environmental cues, such as the seasons. Maybe they're dressed a certain way according to the season or a festival that's coming up. Your towns and your regions should have some handouts to give your players for visual and inspiration. So if you're in a medieval town, then you would hope you could find some photos that you could share of what your PCs might look like if you need to. And I would save that for more important NPCs. I wouldn't do that for every single encounter. That's a lot of work and it's unnecessary. But you should have a few photos on hand in case you want to make one of your NPCs important throughout your quest, even if you hadn't planned on it. I think it's a good idea to have some of that. Also, make use of unidentified features. So in Fantasy Ground, you can actually use this non-ID title. So if you click on that, what it does is if you put a description in here where it says non-ID name, you would put commoner here, but up here in the title, you would actually give this character a name. So when you put it on the combat tracker, it would say commoner, but once the characters get to know who this is, then they'll learn his name, and then you can just identify this particular character. So just like the dragon, you may not know its name as Ember unless you discuss something with maybe the lore giver. So Ember is its true name, but you're going to see Red Dragon in the description when it goes onto the combat tracker. Make use of that feature. It's handy. It keeps from getting away from the generic tropes. And what I like about it is, it kind of keeps the players guessing a little bit. It makes it a little less obvious, but it's a red dragon, so it's kind of hard to disguise that fact. But it does have a name, it does have a personality, and it does have a lair, and it does have a purpose. So, you can mix and match those to suit your campaign. But in a social encounter, one of the things that you can add to help this are random tables. So it's an important tool for both for a DM in both combat and social situation for random tables. So if you're not sure what to make up, you can do some canned responses, whatever you need. So in this case, I made a canned response. This is an individual that is sitting outside of the town or the city of Cambria. Not a big city, it's like more like a town. Amber is traveling through, and she comes across a real dandy-looking individual. He's got colorful clothing and almost looks like a clown. He has some pins and embellishments on his self. He's got a little goatee and he's got a little foppish hat. And he says, and I'm going to click on this encounter here. So we just added this onto the back of the sheet here. So utilize this other tab to put more information. So you can link tables, treasure, social things, so on and so forth. So here he says, welcome to Cambria, a humble town of hard-working individuals and a waypoint for weary travelers. So he looks at he looks at Amber and he says, he takes one look at her and says, yeah, she's been traveling for a while. So he says that to her. And then he says, we will celebrate Lord Cambria's founding of our home 250 years ago. If you need any help, I am at your service. So he kind of takes his hat off and he bows. He's kind of offering to be, a friendly voice for the town. So then she
Even
says,
though he insulted me, saying I look like I've been on the road for a while.
yeah, well, I said that. He didn't say that. Let me backpedal a little bit. Another thing is he didn't give his name, right?
Very true.
So now
Which is,
I am
yeah,
stuck.
what
I have
what you actually taught, you didn't.
right. So he has no name. So this would be a good time to have that table or list of names, personalities, those sort of things. So make sure
Perfect.
you have those employed into your game. So make use of that unidentified feature, but also have the name set up so that you can give them a name later as you complete the encounter. Appeal to the five senses. Does he smell like perfume? Or maybe he smells like alcohol. Uh, he shouldn't have a
Amber
taste
probably smells like alcohol.
and sweat. Um, does he taste? I don't know. Maybe he has salty arms. I don't know. Um, you can always, I appealed to how he looked and how he sounded a little bit, but I didn't appeal to how he feels. So feeling is more like his impression. I think he was smiling and being friendly. So if Lady Shell's character Amber had suspicion, she can roll an insight check to see if he is indeed being genuine. Or he could be disingenuous and just be friendly to get something out of her. Then he said, I'm at your service. He bowed. She rolled a 17, so he wasn't performing. So you can tell that he was being genuine. So that's a good roll. She rolled a 17. So that encounter would tell her, well, this guy might be a little weird, but at least he's being friendly. His body language and the way he's carrying himself, the feel of the character, is what's being discovered through her insight. So that is one way to deal with that. So basically base your voice or your character, including questions and suggestions from all other sources in your gaming life. So basically, when we do these classes, make sure you voice your opinions and you tell us, maybe you want to learn how to voice your NPCs better. You have to learn how to improv. But you don't really have to be an actor or a voice actor to make them more interesting. So if you appeal to the senses, you have a name, you have a purpose, a role to them, that will go a long way and it will make sure that this NPC encounter is not completely generic or useless. So have your names ready, have your personalities kind of figured out, and if you don't have those, you can have a table that does it for you. And sometimes it's funner for the DM to play off that than to have it rolled up ahead of time. So that could make it more interesting and have a higher replay value for you. So if you run the encounter or the adventure more than once, it makes it a little different and more interesting. And you'll be more comfortable in that role. So that is the first one, is a social encounter. These are people that greet you, they talk to you, they sometimes give you rumors, whatever it might be. They are there to make the game more interesting, more interactive, and sometimes friendly in place of fighting and combat, or vice versa. They might be there to make your life miserable while you're there. So they might be a spy for the Thieves Guild. Who knows? So these are things you got to think about when you do your social encounters. Are they tied into a faction? Are they part of the government or the law? Are they part of the underworld? Are they just a commoner? So those are things that, in this case, this guy is just a commoner. But by my description, I could have easily said that he might be part of a thieves guild, or maybe he's an evil, sadistic man that locks people up in his basement. You never know. But you need to have some sort of go-to or a way to get through this encounter without becoming too cliche and generic. So that is the social encounter. Social means interacting, talking, joking, that sort of stuff. So now we have this commoner that's a quest giver. So this doesn't necessarily have to be a commoner. We just use the commoner template. But again, we changed the stats to fit a quest giver. We gave them history, gave them a higher persuasion, and we gave them survival. So that is one of the main reasons why we changed the stat blocks, so they have good enough skills. These individuals have to somehow convince you to do a task for them. So commoners are usually just, peasants, serfs, slaves, servants, pilgrims, merchants, artisans, hermits, whatever. Also, they could be a barkeeper, a town leader, a lost child, or a patron noble. So it depends on what you're trying to get across and what the quest is. So in this case, we're saying that quest givers are important NPCs in driving your story. So they are there to hand out the quests for your players to complete. Whether they're on task with the overall arcing theme or not is up to you on how you want to tie that in. But learn how to do this in a manner that is more interesting and fun. How does the quest tie in with the story, or does it? Who is this quest giver? Is it a rich patron, noble type? Is it the mayor, the town leader? Is it a young child that's lost their way? Something like that. That would give a little bit more weight to the story than just some odd person wanting you to do a task. Nothing wrong with that, but it is less likely to tie in with the story. So what's the award or outcome for completing the quest? You should probably have that in mind. Is it just going from point A to B? You get a free bit of information. Maybe you get a map. Maybe you get some gold. Maybe just a free drink, or maybe free room and board. Whatever it is, it should be useful and it should be entertaining. Again, describe, not tell. So learn to describe what's happening. Do not tell us what is being done. That will come out through your storytelling. Again, have your descriptions for your NPCs. Be sure to have some environmental cues, such as your seasons. Make sure that your town and regions have some kind of handouts to give you some visual inspiration. Those sort of things will help. Again, use the unidentified feature if you don't want this person's name revealed right away, or they're using a fake name. Appeal to those senses. So smell, taste, seeing, hearing, feeling, plus magical senses like psychic, impression. There may be a magical component here where you can sense people's motives. So if that's the case, don't let that player lose that spell. If they have a spell or a psychic ability that allows them to sense motivation or good or evil, anything like that, give them cues. Maybe if someone's evil, the person gets a stomach ache or a bad migraine or something like that when they identify a creature as being evil, or if they learn the motive of an evil villain. Or maybe it's vice versa. Maybe this quest giver gives them the vibe of truth and honor and happy-go-lucky or whatever it is. So those are some incentives that you need to appeal to, especially in a quest giver situation. This is kind of a serious thing. This is, you're doing this for that. So a quest giver would basically include like questions and suggestions. They would potentially tell you what happened to them or what will happen to them or what might happen or what has already happened. So it really depends on what the situation is. But the random tables are important for you if you do not have something already in the works. So I made a story item, and this is the main quest that ties in with our lesson. So it says, as the GM, the PCs receive a quest from Sir Trevor. So he's the current ruler, current lord of Cambria. So the celebration that was talked about earlier is in honor of the leaders of Cambria, and this guy, Sir Trevor, is the guy who is the current lord. As of late, the outlying farmers have been complaining and worrying about missing livestock. Sir Trevor was once an adventurer. So he's basically, you know, asking for players to do a mission for him. So he's the quest giver in this case. So he says, I am the mayor, Sir Trevor, of this humble town. I beseech thee to help our farmers discover the reason their livestock is disappearing in mass. Random carcasses have been found along trails that lead into the direction of the mountains. I am willing to award your efforts with a huge package and a big thank you from our community. So he's basically telling you, what he's offering and what he wants. So all you have to do if you read that is discover why and how these livestock is disappearing, maybe even provide a little proof, and then he gave you some clues and hints, and then he gives you the treasure. So what I've done here is I have a quest item. So if you successfully defeat or discover the reason for the missing cattle or the rumors of it, the red dragon is to be discovered, not killed. But if the party does kill the dragon, then you're going to triple this XP award. So this is a quest item. So it's worth 500 if the players go to the mountains and they discover the dragon. So that is one way to award the players. So there's no combat there. It's just a mission, maybe some hazards along the way, and then they discover the lair and they turn around and go back. And they see the evidence. The other thing that we want to share is the parcel. So whatever this package is, it's a really big award. It's Trevor's package has 188 items included, and it's worth 14,000 gold. It only weighs a pound, but whatever it is, it's a big, huge package. So that is the award. So those are some things that you can link straight to the NPC, or you can link it into your story entries wherever this quest may come up. So this is just a story entry with some dialogue in here. As a matter of fact, I should right click on this. So I'm unlocking this. I'm going to right click on it and click on paragraph types, and I'm going to assign the speaker or the person saying it. So as you can see before, I didn't do that. It was just a generic message. So Sir Trevor is the speaker. And if you look, Sir Trevor is actually Sir Robert. So Sir Trevor was once an adventurer. His name really is Sir Robert, but we use words backwards sometimes to make up names. So that's a good way to figure out how to make up names. So Sir Trevor. So now when I click, now it says Sir Trevor is saying this instead of just the game itself. So this is the main quest giver of the story arc. So now we have the next lore giver. So the lore giver could be a quest giver, but usually they are not. They are giving you a chance at getting some good hard information. So either you have to do something for them or they will charge you. Not always, but sometimes. Or they are ordered by Sir Trevor to give you information. So in this case, the common lore giver would be like a sage, a town crier, perhaps some clergy, like from the temples, something along those lines, maybe monks. So lore givers. So these are characters that will help the players with the backstory of the setting, such as the town backstory. These could be in the form from an elder, a bard, a sage, whatever it is. So what types of lore? You have foreshadowing, you have ancient lore, local history, and you might get some information about the story itself without giving the quest. So again, describe not tell. Talk about the setting that this character or this NPC is in. Maybe it's a library, temple, whatever. There could be secondary and tertiary things they can do there. Maybe they can buy things once they're done. Maybe there's potions here. Who knows? So you want to have your descriptions ready to go. Like again, use your unidentified feature if need be. Appeal to the senses, and also give them names if they're kind of important. Um, like I said, if you can't voice them, at least give them the the appeal of sense, each one of them. So you want to appeal to all 5 of the senses if you can, starting with the less obvious, working back to sight. So here's a random table. So this is a lore table. This is example of lore. This is potential. So here I have 4 events. So I have the founding of Cambria, could be one of the lore that's provided. History of the region, which is second most common. Less common is a historic event, which was a major eruption by a mountain nearby. That's about 300 miles away. And then there was a dragon sighting recent past. So when they go to speak to the lore keeper without paying him directly, maybe they just said, "Hey, we just spoke to Trevor and we wanted to come by and see if you know anything." So if that's the case, I can just roll randomly. And in this case, you're going to get history of the region. The history of the region is just going to be a general overview of the setting. The founding of Cambria is going to be an overview of the town, the local area. The historic event is going to talk about a major eruption that took place thousands of years ago, and it created this really bad ash fall. The city was covered with, it's a really scary tale. And the last one, the dragon sighting, would be the one that they would probably want to have for this particular adventure. So if they're willing to pay, so here's the sage information. It is a parcel. It's worth 50 gold. So they get specific information about the quest or a specific question. So whatever they ask, they will get a direct answer if they pay. So in this case, it's negative 50. So if Amber wants this information about this particular quest, I will give her this one, which will be the dragon sightings. And I'm going to drag this over. It adds,
I could do this myself.
right, I'm just saying. So the 50 has now taken it down to negative 35 because it's a negative value.
He
So
did give me enough money.
so he doesn't have, so she owes him a favor on top of the 35 gold that she owes him. So that is one of the things that you can do to create a transaction. So you put the negative value of the cost of the items. In this case, it's negative 50 for the information. So negative 50 gold. So if you don't have the money there's a potential that he might trade for a deed. Maybe you have to find an old book for him. Whatever it is, you need to use that in your story and make it kind of tie in with the setting.
I think Amber would try and because knowing that she didn't have enough money, she would try and say, "Oh, I have this great recipe for this great ale that is specific to my
there you
not
go.
tribe, but where I'm from, my
Mm-hmm.
clan, and I'm planning on making some tomorrow." And I'm willing to give you a mug
There
if
you
you'll
go.
give me this information.
So what I'd want you to do is this guy, he has um, a wisdom check. So I want you to roll persuasion with advantage because you are telling the truth and you are actually carrying said recipe. So your body language, so you rolled a 13 total, which isn't bad, especially with your not as charismatic. So now I'm going to roll his ability check, which would be wisdom in this case, because he doesn't have insight like the other guys do. So I'm going to do the check. He has to roll higher. So he believes your story, but he wants something else because he knows it's going to take several months for that to happen. So
He
now what?
didn't believe that I'd have the ale made tomorrow.
Well, no, he knows you can make the ale, but he also is smart enough to realize that the ale is not going to be ready for a few months. So he says, I need something more immediate. I like the offer. I'm very curious, and I will accept that in 3 months. But for
Do I
now,
get the information in 3 months too?
exactly. So that would be the dilemma. Or you can offer something else.
Let me look in my inventory.
So kind of role playing with this guy. He's probably a real stickler. I mean, you could give him a personality where he's a crotchety old man, a little bit stubborn, not mean or anything, just kind of, I need something for something. He's old school. He doesn't believe in freebies, especially with this secret that he has. If he gives out this secret, he thinks that he might be in danger or incur the wrath of the dragon. So that is
I
why.
have something.
Okay.
I'm part of the Order of the Gauntlet, and they're all like good people, right? Goody
Mhm.
goody. So maybe my background in being part of the Order of the Gauntlet would give me some kind of like, you know,
Okay.
up the level or whatever.
Yeah. So what I'd like you to do is roll with advantage for your persuasion. So you're going to try one more time to persuade him to give you the information based off your background.
There, hope that was better. I'll show you my
Wow.
badge too. My
He
little
says,
badge.
he says, that is wonderful news. That would have been so helpful to me had you come here a month prior when I was having trouble with my daughter-in-law's wedding, and I couldn't get any of the groomsmen to pay up their share of the wedding costs. So, with that in mind, being that you are part of the Order of the Gauntlet, I do recognize your importance, and you will be rewarded with the information that you want. So he finally breaks down and he tells you what you need to know about the dragon. So after, 5 or 10 minutes of haggling with him about the information, you finally find out through him, he says, in the day when Trevor was a babe, his father had made a deal with the dragon who lives in the mountains. And yes, it is a dragon, a horrible red dragon. He goes by the name of Ember, and he has been around for many, many years, as long as I have been alive. Traditionally, we have given the dragon tribute. When leadership was handed to Trevor, this little detail was left out. The dragon did not get his tribute, so he has gone on a rampage, and I fear that it is he that is killing the livestock because his tribute was not met. I try to approach Trevor about this, but he wouldn't hear it. He doesn't believe that it's the dragon. He wasn't alive the last time the dragon made an appearance, and he doesn't listen too well about the rumors and the lore regarding the dragon's appearance in the past. So he's kind of ignorant about that fact. But he is willing to pony up and pay to have someone investigate. So that's a start. And being that that's you, that you're taking this job, I have no problems giving you this. And he hands you this beautiful brass looking ring. It's kind of a reddish brassy color. It's got glyphs on it and a really beautiful ruby like stone. And he says, this was passed to me by my family, and I think you could use it. And he just hands it to you. Doesn't tell you anything about it other than it was a family heirloom and that he wants you to have it for good luck.
Well,
So,
Amber, knowing that he said that it was a family heirloom, realizes it must be important even though she doesn't know what it is. She will put it.
okay. So he seems satisfied and he sends you on your way. So he says, if you ever need any help or information, I will either give you a discount or give it to you for free.
Super. Thank you so much.
Yep. So that was a positive encounter. That went well. Did some skill checks, you did a little haggling, you traded, those sort of things would be what you'd want to do with a lore giver. And they don't always give their lore out for free, but they don't always charge either. So it depends on the situation and how the role playing goes. So make sure you give these people a little bit of a voice and reason why they do things. So in this case, he wanted to make sure she was genuine. And once he discovered that she was taking the quest that Trevor had set forth, he was a lot more willing to help her and that she wasn't just someone passing through. So that's why he was reserved. So that has to do with the quest and how it fits in with the setting. So you have this town of Cambria. You have the leader Trevor, who was just a little baby the last time the dragon made an appearance, and his father forgot to hand him down that little tidbit of information. So something as important as that was not given and passing down to his son. So that is basically the information that was given. So I think we're about at 2 hours. I think we were going to call this a stream. We will return later for part two, in which we will execute the tactics that will be used by the dragon, and we will watch our brave Amber Frostbeard enter the lair of the dragon, and she will try to discover if the dragon is true and if the rumors are true, and find out if it is the dragon who's been destroying the cattle and taking them from the farmers. So we will return at the top of the next hour, and we'll go for another hour and a half or so for part two of bringing your characters to life running the game. So, do you have any closing comments?
Oh, yes, I do. I have a link that I'm going to put in the chat that will take you to our website, and you can go to this link and fill out the form there. Let us know what you think about this class. If you have any ideas of what you think we might be able to add to it, or if you think it's right the way it is, just give us your comments on it. We'd really like your feedback on this.
Yeah, so we intend to potentially turn this into a class. this is kind of a large um, attempt at trying to figure out the curriculum and what we're going to teach. So based off your feedback and your consideration, especially if you're a game master or a developer, I would definitely like to see and hear what you have to say about these type of topics, because this is kind of a beginning of a new potential class that we might start teaching in college. And there's no better way than just to try it out and see what kind of interest it brings. So we will see you at the top of the hour. We'll take about an hour break, a little less because it's 10 after the hour or so now. So we will come back for part two. So if you're around and you can, spend time here, we will continue with part two, which will be more of the strategy, actually showing how it works, the battlefield, and talking about the different options that you have as a gamer or as a player and the DM. So that'll be helpful. So we'll talk to you later. I'll call this a stream and call it for right now, and we'll come back later.
Bye, everyone.
Bye bye.